My name's Kathy Sherrington, so I'm a professor at the University of Sydney and based at the Sydney Local Health District at the Institute for Musculoskeletal Health. And so I'm part of the Falls Network executive alongside others who you've heard from or will hear from. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Ruth Peters. And Ruth is the program lead for dementia at the George Institute for Global Health and conjoint professor at UNSW. And her research uses clinical trials and evidence synthesis to identify ways to prevent, delay or treat three of the most significant disorders of ageing, being dementia, hypertension and also frailty. And she was actually one of the first to start synthesising evidence on dementia risk factors as part of her PhD and also her highly competitive NIHR postdoctoral fellowship at Imperial College London. So she's another key expert from overseas who we're delighted to have welcomed to Australia. And so Ruth's going to be talking about dementia prevention and practical risk reduction. Welcome, Professor Peters.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to present here today. Just make sure I can see the time so I don't keep talking. So, one of the things I've been asked to talk about today is the practical aspects of dementia risk reduction. So how can we realistically get the most bang for our buck in terms of reducing dementia incidence and prevalence in the population? But I thought I'd start with a very quick overview. I don't know how familiar with dementia all of you are, so a very, very quick overview of what dementia is and what causes it, and what are the main lifestyle and clinical risk factors that we know about that relate to dementia, to lead us really into the focus of today's talk, which is the strongest evidence for risk reduction, so really the clinical trial evidence. And just to begin with then, I thought I'd just remind everyone of the shape of the dementia prevalence curve with ageing. So I've got age along the bottom here. This is old data now, actually. This is from the year 2000. But it doesn't really matter. The key thing that I'd like you to take away from this slide is the curve. So as we age, prevalence of dementia goes up. Aging is the biggest risk factor for dementia. Now, you might have heard that in recent years we've shown that the incidence of dementia, which also shows an increased curve with aging, but you might have heard that the incidence of dementia is falling, which is fantastic news. And it has been shown in some populations, probably because we're better at cardiovascular risk control and cardiovascular risk reduction. So great news. Does seem like we're able to reduce the incidence of dementia, but as we've been hearing all morning, we've got an aging population. That means that more people are going to be developing diagnosis of dementia, and we have more people in that at-risk group, which means greater absolute numbers. So we haven't solved this issue yet. We still need to keep on understanding and thinking about dementia prevention and dementia risk reduction. And again, just as a reminder, dementia is a syndromal diagnosis rather than a single disease pathway. So Alzheimer's disease is probably the disease pathway that most people have heard of, but there's also in particular vascular pathologies that contribute to incident dementia and other different types of pathology. And in fact, in late life, we know that probably more than half of dementia cases, and in late life here I'm talking about an arbitrary cutoff of 65 and over, it's usually what we refer to as late life dementia. We know that more than half of cases have mixed pathology. So even if someone has a clinical diagnosis of, say, Alzheimer's disease, there is a chance that they will also have other pathologies happening at the same time, contributing to that dementia. And vascular pathologies are one of the potentially most common ones of those. So that makes it complex. And given that, you'll be unsurprised to hear that there are many, many risk factors. And you've probably heard of a number of the different risk factors for dementia already. I just picked some here to demonstrate because actually there are so many, the slide would be very crowded if I tried to put them all on here. If you're particularly interested in this area, the Lancet Commission on Dementia has done a series they've done several updates of the Lancet Commission on Dementia that looks in particular at population attributable risk, so the dementia risk factors that are arguably most relevant at a population level. And they summarise some of the leading risk factors, but there are so many. What I've tried to do here is just select ones that make it easy to see that we can cluster them really into kind of more lifestyle type risk factors and more clinical type risk factors. And then maybe arguably more kind of engagement related risk factors. Excuse me. And you can just see from looking at this that they're all likely to have relationships with each other. It's highly unlikely that someone's going to have one risk factor and a clean diagnosis of a pure dementia type. So really we have to take into account multiple different contributing factors here. Now, there's clinical trial evidence probably across all these different risk factors to a greater or lesser degree. What I'm really going to focus on today is where we've got clinical trial evidence where we've shown actual benefit, either in dementia risk reduction or clear cognitive benefit from at least a couple of big trials, and things that are also implementable. So I'm aware that there's much more data out there, and even the data I'm talking about is just the tip of the iceberg. And the other thing to say is if anyone has any questions, because I'm really skimming across big areas of the research here, I'm happy for you to reach out. I do have to leave pretty quickly after this, so I might not be here for questions after the end of my talk, but please feel free to email me if you have questions. So focusing then on the practical risk reduction aspect. And there are two areas. There are two areas that I work in, and my argument is that these are the two areas where we've got the most evidence for effective dementia risk reduction so far. So I'm going to start by talking about blood pressure lowering, and then I'm going to move on to talk about multi-domain risk reduction. Now, multi-domain risk reduction is tackling multiple risk factors at the same time, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But first, blood pressure lowering. Now, I guess a lot of you may have heard that blood pressure is a risk factor for dementia. Actually, there's lots and lots of plausible mechanisms to link high blood pressure to increased risk of dementia. We know that high blood pressure has an impact on vascular structure, we know it has an impact on vascular function, and unsurprisingly, that could potentially have an impact on brain function. So there's lots of plausible mechanisms. The other part of this argument is that there's lots and lots of epidemiological evidence. So over the last 30 years, there's been an increasingly large body of evidence showing high blood pressure at an earlier life stage is associated with increased risk of dementia or cognitive decline at a later life stage. It's pretty incontrovertible. The evidence is strongest for high blood pressure in midlife, so between 40 and 65, or 45 and 60, depending on your cut points. But there is still evidence for high blood pressure in late life. And in fact, in late life, the evidence base is arguably more mixed, with high blood pressure showing an increased risk of dementia in some studies, a decreased risk in other studies, and no relationship in yet further studies. Why is that? Possibly because of the diversity that we find in older adult populations in the epidemiological data. And that's something really important to take account of, because I'm going to talk about clinical trial evidence today. So the evidence I'm talking about is the most robust evidence for risk reduction because it comes from controlled clinical trials. But of course, we all know that the populations going into clinical trials might be slightly different to the populations in epidemiological studies, and again, slightly different to the general population. But we know that there's a lot of epidemiology to support and mechanisms to support the relationship between high blood pressure and increased risk of dementia. The other thing about blood pressure lowering, I think that makes it particularly practical, is that the treatments are out there in clinical practice already. So there are lots and lots of blood pressure treatments out there. They're available. They've been available for a long time. And it doesn't seem to matter which, from a dementia perspective, which blood pressure lowering agents you use as long as you're lowering the blood pressure. Excuse me. So it's potentially a very practical tool that we have at our disposal that we can use to reduce risk in the population. Thank you. So that being said, it's important to look at the clinical trials. And there were 5 large, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that collected data on incident dementia. Why is that important? There have been more trials out there. They haven't all been placebo-controlled. The fact that there were 5 large placebo-controlled trials gives us an amazing opportunity to put those trials together to look at the relationship between treatment versus placebo on incident dementia. Now, we need to put all 5 trials together because actually incident dementia, although it has a big impact in our society because people live with it for a long period of time, is actually relatively, incidence rates are actually relatively low compared to other disorders or diseases. So we need a large number of people in order to be able to look at dementia risk reduction. You need to follow people up over time, obviously, because it develops slowly, and we need a large number of people. And all of the trials, there's actually never been a trial that was primarily designed to look at blood pressure lowering with a dementia outcome with a placebo arm. And it's no longer possible to do such a trial because now we know we should treat blood pressure anyway. So we have this lovely repository of data that we can go back to and examine this hypothesis with this really high quality data. So that's what we did. We put together 5 different trials. These are the acronyms for the trials. The details don't matter. Happy to answer questions on those if anyone's interested. But the upshot is that we ended up with 28,000 individuals from 20 different countries. And it's interesting here to point out that the mean age was 69.1. So we're actually into that early late life population. So the population where there was a little bit of uncertainty about the relationship between blood pressure and instant dementia, actually we are looking at that population now in the trials. Almost half were female, and the median follow-up was around 4 years. You'll see that the baseline blood pressure is probably a little higher than we would like today, but bear in mind that these were placebo-controlled trials that were testing the efficacy of antihypertensives, way back when people didn't know whether or not they should use antihypertensives for cardiovascular risk reduction. So obviously people were starting with slightly higher blood pressures than we would tolerate today, because now we know that we should be lowering the blood pressure. And you can see that the randomization was balanced, and you can see that this is, the graph shows that the trials found a separation in blood pressure between their 2 arms. So we know that they did what they intended to, that the placebo arm had a higher blood pressure and the active arm had a lower blood pressure. And there were 861 incident dementia cases. And these are the headline results. So incident dementia was 2.9% in those in the antihypertensive group versus 3.3% in those randomized to placebo. And actually there was a slight differential dropout, more dropout in the placebo arm, meaning that these results, if anything, are potentially estimating the outcome. And you can see that the main result here as an odds ratio of 0.868, showing a significant reduction in instant dementia cases with treatment. And the treatment was around a drop of blood pressure of around 10/5. I don't want to go into the details too much about this, other than to say, with additional adjustments, it didn't really make much difference, so it seems to be a robust finding. So I think we can be pretty confident that blood pressure lowering is a practical tool to reduce incident dementia in the population. And we also looked a little bit at the subgroups. I'm sorry, that's possibly a little too small to see, but you can see by and large the subgroups are actually all falling on the left-hand side of the line. And maybe there's a suggestion that those with the highest blood pressure at baseline and those of the oldest age group actually benefited least. So maybe there is an argument for tailoring treatment a little bit more to that early late life rather than the later late life. And we're doing additional work now looking at the role of frailty in this process to try to really understand who to treat and how to treat. So that's my argument for the first key argument. The first most important point to make, I think, is that we have really strong evidence now for blood pressure control for dementia risk reduction in the population. But you know what? We saw there were many, many risk factors. Looking across one risk factor is just not going to be enough. These are results from a systematic review and meta-analysis we did a few years ago now, and we combined all of the studies that had looked at the impact of more than one risk factor, and you can see that the increase in risk from increasing number of risk factors is very, very steep. So realistically, let's look at blood pressure, of course, but let's also look at more than one risk factor at the same time. And that takes me to multi-domain risk reduction. Now, there have been a couple of big trials in multi-domain risk reduction, so that's tackling multiple risks at the same time. There are a lot of trials ongoing. There are a lot of questions out there about dose and duration and intensity of intervention. As you can imagine, multi-domain risk reduction, tackling diet, tackling physical activity, tackling social engagement, tackling cognitive engagement, tackling cardiovascular risk. It's sort of endlessly variable. And so we don't know enough yet, but we do know that there have been a couple of big trials. So the Finnish finger trial which was in people aged 60 to 77 and tackled different risk factor areas. So they had exercise support, they had dietary support, they had cardiovascular risk reduction support, and they had cognitive training, found a benefit for the actively treated versus control group. And then more recently, UNSW, Henry Brodati's Maintain Your Brain trial has found a similar benefit in the group that were given the multi-domain risk reduction online tools. So I think we can say now that we think multi-domain risk reduction is also a mechanism that works, and it seems to work better than targeting some of those individual lifestyle risk factors one by one, combining them. But that's great, but how do we do it in practice? And we've heard from some of the speakers earlier on today, it's complex. How do we deliver multiple exercise interventions? How do we do this across the population? How do we do this in the community? How do we reach everyone we need to reach? How can we actually operationalize risk reduction in a cost-effective way? And have sort of personalized engagement and support. And we're actually doing a trial at the moment, and that's what I'd really like to talk to you about in a bit more detail. Our trial is trying to tackle this from a slightly novel approach to what's the best way to say, to suck people in, to draw their interest in, to engaging in multi-domain risk reduction without having to say, today is your exercise, tomorrow you have to do your cognitive training, the day after that you have to do your social engagement, here's your healthy eating plan. Can we somehow draw it together in a fun activity so we employ more of a health by stealth model? And we're using something called intergenerational practice. And intergenerational practice is bringing two generations together, non-adjacent generations, for mutual benefit. We're choosing to bring together older adults and preschool children. Anyone who saw the TV show Old People's Home for 4-year-olds will be familiar with the concept. So we're building on that. And essentially, the idea is that for the adults, we can deliver a multi-domain risk reduction. So we can, a lot of the games that children play have physical activity aspects to them. They have cognitive activity aspects to them. They have social engagement aspects to them. So we can bring in games, get everybody playing games together, having lots and lots of fun. It becomes very competitive. It's very enjoyable. Everybody enters into the spirit. But actually, at the same time, people are bending and stretching and moving and using their brain, even tasks like, my auntie went shopping and she bought where you have to remember a lot of items, or learning actions to a game, to a song where you've got to sing the song and stand up and do the actions. And we can tailor the actions and we can tailor the movements to people's abilities, and also tailor the cognitive aspects to people's abilities. And the plus side is it also gives the opportunities for generativity, so that transfer of knowledge and culture to the next generation, which people often find to be something very, very important that they feel that they would like to do. There are also benefits for the children, potentially, and it's lots and lots of fun. And ideally, it would also bring benefit for local communities, because it would draw communities together, because people we know anecdotally from the work we've already done, people become more embedded in their local community. So they're out shopping and they might see the children that they've been playing with in the intergenerational session, for example. There are plausible mechanisms here too. You can see some of them on the screen. I'm not going to go into detail because I'm going to run out of time if I do. But you can see physical activity, cognitive activity, social activity, and we also embed diet in this. So we have a healthy eating week where all of the activities are around diet and healthy eating, dietary engagement. So all of the games are around diet. In fact, each week is themed. We bring people together for 2 hours a week. I'm going to talk about the trial in a couple of slides' time. But we're able to combine all of those aspects of multi-domain risk reduction that were shown to be successful in the FINGERS trial and the Maintain Your Brain trial into this package. So there are plausible mechanisms as well. So this is all great, but do people actually like it? This is a novel method. We recently collated all of the qualitative data out there on older adult perceptions of intergenerational activities. And this is just some of the things that people say. And I broadly tried to categorize them. It's very rough, it's not scientific. But people talk about things that are important to them over and above the multi-domain risk reduction approach. They're not coming to this because they're saying, I need to do a multi-domain risk reduction for my cognition, or I need to do a multi-domain risk reduction for my frailty. They're coming because they're saying, this is fun, it might help the children, and by the way, I might also get a benefit from it. So people talked about being needed, feeling valued, being listened to, having purpose, things like well-being, appreciating the moment, hope for the future. So lots of positive feelings coming out of being part of an intergenerational activity program. So that all made us say, well, this is great, but is this something that people are interested in? Is this something we can actually do? This is a great theory. So we started by looking at the evidence, and we did a systematic review, and we found that actually there is no evidence. There's very little robust clinical trial data in this area. So we know multi-domain risk reduction works. What we don't know is whether this can be encapsulated using an intergenerational approach, and whether that's a fun way to deliver it in a community-based setting. So we found that there was an evidence gap. Is there a need? Yes. Do people want it? We also did a survey and some qualitative work, and we got a resounding yes. People said things like, please make this happen. So, okay, people want this, the community wants it. There are certainly some people out there who are interested and engaged. Then we thought, well, can we even deliver this? So we did a small feasibility study. We got partway through, and then we were hit by COVID, but we showed that we could actually do this in a community setting. So now we know we can do it. Now we know we can deliver this in a preschool, in the community, in real life. Then we did a pilot trial with 2 sites, and we showed that actually we can do this in a pilot trial setting. And then we were fortunate enough to get funding, so we have NH and MRC funding now to do a main trial. And we're partway through the trial at the moment. So we're working with 44, excuse me, it might even be more than 44 preschools at the end, to do a single-blind, community co-designed, cluster randomized waitlist control trial. So the cluster randomized, the unit of randomization here is the preschool, and the intervention arm immediately gets 20 weeks of sessions, 2 hours a week, and we go into the preschool, we take all of the kit that we need with us, and we deliver a 2-hour session that's themed, and in each week, we make sure that there are physical activity targets met, that there are cognitive activity targets, that social engagement targets. And we have a morning tea that allows us to focus on diet, and we have a dietary week as well. And then all the other weeks have different themes, because in our feasibility work, we heard from the older adults that older adults don't want to play. As adults, we get a bit bored of playing after a while. It's a bit abstract. But if we make a theme, it becomes much more interesting. So each week has a theme, like construction or adventure, for example. And that makes it a little bit easier to make them flow and a little bit more fun. At the moment, we are about a third of the way complete. So we've completed about a third of the sites. We have about just over another third of the sites running. We have other sites waiting in the wings. We're constantly on the lookout for older adults. Actually, getting the children from the local preschools is not so difficult because they're all already in the preschool and parents are quite keen. So if you do know anybody over the age of 65 who's in the community who wants to engage in this across Sydney, please do reach out, because we're very, very keen to have people engaged. And what we find is that initially people say, 20 weeks, that's quite a big commitment. But then once people are in, they want to keep going, and nobody wants it to end, which is nice for us to hear. I think anecdotally we're hearing lots of positive things. Of course, anecdotally is not enough, and so we're collecting a lot of additional data. So a big shout out to this is the trial team that's working on the trial. These are all of the outcomes that we're collecting. So our primary endpoint here is actually frailty, using the frailty index. And then we have cognition also. We're collecting cognition using the NIH battery to be as robust as possible. It's an online battery. And then, of course, other things that we think might be impacted by intergenerational practice and multi-domain risk reduction, such as quality of life, mood, physical performance, etc. We are collecting data on falls and fear of falling as well, because there's a chance that we might be impacting on falls with the physical activity engagement that we're doing. And as well as collecting data before the sessions start and at the end of the sessions, we are also doing follow-up with the intervention group a monthly follow-up afterwards for up to a year, just to check in and see what happened after the study finished. And of course, for the children as well, we are collecting data on language, empathy, and theory of mind. And there are a lot of moving parts in this trial, as you can imagine. We've got preschools, we've got preschool educators, we've got children, we've got parents, we've got older adults. It's important that we collect data from all aspects, so we're also trying to collect data from the educators, because sometimes the educators will see things happening in the children that the parents and our testing won't see. So that's where we're up to at the moment, and we've got a number of different sub-studies running over and above that, looking at taking that implementation further, but hopefully this is an implementable, practical risk reduction approach to multi-domain risk reduction that can run in communities alongside maybe targeting that key clinical risk factor of blood pressure. And so going back to focusing on the potential for implementation, I'm selecting out antihypertensives and multi-domain risk reduction because they're the ones that I believe where we currently have the most robust clinical trial evidence and that can be implemented. Very aware that intergenerational practice is likely to suit only a proportion of the older adult population, but that I think is true for all interventions. The nice thing about it is it might have multiple other benefits over and above cognition and frailty, and it's also a fast expanding research area, so I would say watch this space because there's a lot of research coming out of this kind of area as people figure out that as a potentially important tool. And I'm just going to end with a picture of some of the sock puppets made by our participants.
Fantastic. What an awesome approach. We've got time for a couple of questions, and just to remind the people online that you can put questions via Slido, and Dana here is waiting there for them. So yeah, any questions? I think someone's waving over there. Do we have a microphone person? Slight little... Right. Would you like to shout and then I can repeat it?
Has there been research done with, in Wales with shingles injections and dementia?
So a question about shingles injections and dementia in Wales, some research.
Yes, that's super topical. It came out recently, the study in Wales, and also there's an Australian study out, I think earlier this week, showing the same thing. And for anyone who isn't aware, that's looking at the introduction of the shingles vaccine. And because the shingles vaccine was introduced for a specific age group on a specific day, you can take a neat kind of quasi-trial and look at the impact of people just before that and just after that introduction on the grounds that they would, the populations would effectively be the same, and then look at incident dementia subsequently. And yes, it looks very promising, and I think there's going to be a lot more work in that space. The Australian results show the same thing, interestingly.
Interesting. Good question. Any other questions? What did it show as the follow-up?
A reduced dementia incidence in the people who had the vaccine.
Who else has got a question? One here with a microphone.
I think I can talk. Just a quickie. With the current trial that is happening, so the community dwelling elderly have to go to the preschools. Is that what it means? And so will they be screened as to who will be going to the preschools? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So the model that we're working on at the moment is embedded in the community, people living locally, able to go to the preschools, because we also wanted to build community connections. But absolutely anyone coming in has to have a working with children check. So that's anyone who's not based in New South Wales, that's the safety measure for working with children, which is free to get for volunteers. And we can facilitate people getting that, but that's a minimum requirement. The other thing to say is that we don't leave the adults and children alone at any given time, so we bring in about 10 adults and about 10 children. They're in a defined space, they're not within the rest of the preschool, so those are children whose parents have consented, only getting involved. And then with the adults, we have our educator that goes in to deliver the sessions. We have a researcher that's also there to look after the older adults, and we have an educator from the preschool itself who knows the children. So we have 3 separate people in there delivering the session alongside. So we really make sure that there's minimal risk to adults and children.
Sorry, knowing our elderly, there's huge dropouts. What would happen if they tend to stop in between?
Yeah, we might just have to move on, sorry, because I just want to go to one of the online questions, which is about plaque-reducing drugs that have been approved in the US, UK and Japan. Thought give you a curly one before you go.
Thank you. So Alzheimer's disease is one of the pathological pathways that increases risk of getting dementia. There are drugs now out there that are disease-modifying. They have been tested in certain populations. The testing of those is going more broadly at the moment, and they have been licensed for use in those populations. I think, from memory, they require a certain level of cognition for their prescribing, but the key thing here is that is tackling one pathological pathway. And whilst that is a potential benefit and has been shown to impact cognition to a degree, so that's fantastic, and it's the first disease-modifying drugs that we've got for Alzheimer's disease. Arguably, that's not yet the most implementable practical risk reduction approach. It may be in the future.
Perfect. Very good answer. Excellent. So, thank you so much, Ruth. That was amazing. Don't go just yet, because we're just going to bring up Dr. Stephen Fu, who's the project officer for the network, who's just going to give Ruth a small gift and a certificate in recognition of her great talk. So thank you. And Dana to take a quick photo. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much again.